10. The chant from the ballroom floor was a roar, a physical wave of sound crashing against the glass walls. 9. I didn't hear the rest. I only felt the warmth of her breath, a ghost of heat against the shell of my ear, cutting through the cold air of the balcony. Are you still here for the midnight kiss? The question wasn't playful. It was heavy, laden with the specific gravity of a board director speaking to a subordinate she shouldn't be standing this close to. The champagne flute in my hand tilted dangerously. The world narrowed down to the scent of her perfume, sandalwood and something colder, like rain on pavement. 8. The countdown continued, but for me, time had already stopped. To understand how we ended up here, breaths mingling in the winter air, we have to go back to when the night was still just a job. The evening began with the architecture of distance. The venue was a monolith of glass and steel, soaring above the city like a monument to capital. It was designed to make you feel small, and it succeeded. The air inside was scrubbed clean and chilled to a precise 68 degrees, smelling of expensive lilies and old money. I walked in through the service entrance, checking the manifest on my tablet, ensuring the flow of the night would be as seamless as the marble floors beneath my heels. My role was simple: invisible competence. I was the grease in the gears, the person who ensured the executives could play their games without worrying about the logistics of the board. Then I saw her, Adrienne. She stood near the center of the room, but she wasn't part of it. She was observing it. She wore a dress the color of midnight, tailored with a precision that bordered on weaponized. The fabric clung to her frame, outlining a posture that was rigid, unyielding. She held a crystal tumbler of sparkling water like it was a chess piece she was waiting to move. She didn't look like she was enjoying the party. She looked like she was auditing it. That was Adrienne, distant, precise, untouchable. I adjusted my headset, answering a query about the catering, but my eyes kept drifting back to her. We had a history, if you could call it that. Not of words, but of silences. Long, heavy silences in board meetings, where her gaze would linger on me while I presented the quarterly figures. A look that felt like it was peeling back the layers of my professional persona to see what lay beneath. But we never acknowledged it. The hierarchy was a physical thing between us, a wall as real as the glass separating us from the winter night outside. She was the strategy, I was the execution. She was the board, I was the payroll. I made my way through the crowd, dodging trays of hors d'oeuvres and ambitious junior VPs. I needed to check the microphone levels on the stage, but my path took me past her circle. I intended to slip by unnoticed, a shadow in the periphery, but as I passed, she turned. It wasn't a casual glance, it was a lock. "Miss Hayes," she said. Her voice was low, cutting through the ambient chatter of 100 conversations. I stopped, turning to face her. "Director, my glass is empty," she stated, holding out the tumbler. It wasn't a request. It was a test. I took the glass, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a sudden spark of static that had nothing to do with the dry winter air. It was a jolt of recognition. I felt the shock of it travel up my arm, settling heavy in my chest. It was the texture of authority mixed with something far more primal. "I'll handle it immediately," I replied, my voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of my heart. She didn't say thank you. She just nodded, her eyes dark and unreadable, tracking me as I walked away. The air between us remained charged, thick with an unacknowledged tension that felt dangerous in a room full of people who watched everything. It was a suffocating kind of pull, the gravity of a planet you know you shouldn't get too close to. I retrieved her water, returned it with the same professional distance, and retreated to the edges of the room. I thought that was it. I thought I could survive the night by staying in the shadows, keeping the architecture of our roles intact. But the universe has a way of laughing at our carefully constructed boundaries. It was 9:47 p.m. when my phone vibrated against my hip. A single notification. Not a text, but a priority alert from the media monitoring software. I looked down, the blue light illuminating the sudden dread in my stomach. A merger leak. The calm surface of the evening was about to shatter. The notification on my screen wasn't just a message. It was a fracture in the evening's carefully polished glass. A secondary market blog had picked up chatter about the merger. They didn't have the details, but they had the name of the acquisition target and a speculative price that was dangerously close to the truth. If this hit the mainstream feeds while Adrienne was on stage giving her welcome toast, the stock would nosedive before the midnight ball dropped. The gala, designed to project stability and wealth, would become a backdrop for a PR massacre. I didn't run. Panic is for people who don't have a plan. But I moved with a velocity that cut through the social friction of the room. I tracked Adrienne's position. She was standing near the velvet ropes of the ballroom entrance, the lights catching the sharp line of her jaw as she nodded at a donor. She was seconds away from walking into the main spotlight, completely exposed. I intercepted her just as she turned to the double doors. I didn't wait for permission. I stepped into her personal space, closer than protocol allowed, effectively blocking her path. "Director," I said, my voice pitched low, under the swell of the string quartet. She looked down at me, a flicker of irritation in her eyes at the interruption, which vanished the moment she saw the expression on my face. She knew the look of a crisis. "What is it?" "Leak," I whispered. "Side channel. We have 3 minutes before it aggregates to the main feeds." The change in her was instant. The socialite vanished, the strategist emerged. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She looked at me. "Where?" "Coat room," I said. "It's the only secure line close enough." She nodded, a sharp, singular motion, and followed me. We slipped away from the heavy oak doors of the ballroom and into the narrow, dimly lit corridor that led to the VIP coat check. The space was small, essentially a walk-in closet lined with mink, wool, and cashmere, smelling of damp winter air and expensive leather. I dismissed the attendant with a single, hard look, and he scrambled out, closing the door behind him. The silence that followed was abrupt and heavy. The roar of the party was instantly muffled, replaced by the hum of the ventilation and the sound of our own breathing. The room was tiny, forcing a proximity that felt illicit. I brought up the tablet, the blue light casting harsh shadows on the furs surrounding us. "Show me," she commanded. She didn't take the tablet from me. Instead, she stepped in. She moved until her shoulder pressed firmly against mine, her arm brushing against my side. The contact was startlingly solid. In the ballroom, she was an idea, a figurehead on a pedestal. Here, in the dark of the coat room, she was warm, physical, and overwhelming. Her scent filled the small space, drowning out the smell of the damp wool and leather surrounding us. I held the screen steady, but my hand trembled. Just once. Instead of pulling away, she leaned closer, her breath hitching slightly as she read the damaging text. I watched her profile, the way her eyes scanned the data with terrifying speed. Most executives would be screaming by now. They would be looking for someone to blame. Adrienne was silent. She was calculating. "It's speculative," she said finally, her voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "They don't have the term sheet." "No," I agreed, my voice sounding too loud to my own ears. "But they have the timeline." "Kill it," she said. The command was simple, brutal, and precise. Draft a denial based on the timeline and accuracy. Technically true, legally safe. Do it now. She didn't move away to give me space to type. She stayed right there, her body a rigid line of heat against mine, watching my fingers fly across the glass screen. It was a display of unflinching command that I found devastatingly attractive. There is a specific kind of intimacy in shared crisis, a vulnerability in seeing the person behind the power structure working without a net. She wasn't performing for the board now. She was surviving. "Sent," I breathed out, tapping the final command. We watched the progress bar load, shoulder to shoulder, two conspirators in a room full of other people's skins. The confirmation flashed green. The crisis was contained. The adrenaline that had spiked in my blood began to settle, but it didn't leave. It just changed texture. The professional panic evaporated, leaving behind a raw, high-voltage tension that had nowhere to go. We were alone. We were safe. And we were standing far too close. The screen went dark, swallowing the only light in the room. The crisis was dead, buried under a layer of legal precision and digital silence. But the silence in the room? That was alive. It pressed against the walls of the coat room, sealing us in. Neither of us moved. The logical thing to do would have been to step back, to reclaim the 2 feet of professional distance that HR mandates and common sense requires. but logic had evaporated with the adrenaline. I stood there, holding the tablet like a shield that had become useless. I could feel the heat radiating from her arm, a warmth that seemed to seep through the silk of my blouse and settle into my skin. I watched the rise and fall of her chest. It was slower now. The sharp, shallow breaths of the crisis were deepening, lengthening into something that sounded almost like relief. I saw the tension in her jaw, that perpetual, clenched readiness, soften. It was a transformation so subtle that if I hadn't been standing inside her personal space, I would have missed it.
She closed her eyes for a second. Just 1 second.
But in that second, the board director vanished. The woman who remained looked exhausted.
"I detest these things," she murmured.
The words were soft, barely more than an exhale, dropping into the quiet space between us like stones in deep water. I blinked, the confession catching me off guard. Adrian didn't complain. Adrian executed. "The gala?" I asked, keeping my voice hushed. "The performance," she corrected, opening her eyes. They weren't scanning for threats anymore. They were focused entirely on me. The constant, relentless observation, being a statue in a glass box. She glanced at the rows of coats. "Sometimes I think the only honest thing in this building is the HVAC system." It was a crack in the marble, a glimpse of the fatigue that lived behind the strategy. It was the most dangerous thing she could have shown me. Competence I could handle. I admired it. But vulnerability? Vulnerability creates a vacuum that demands to be filled. "You make it look effortless," I said. It wasn't flattery. It was an observation of fact. She let out a short, dry sound, the ghost of a laugh. "That is the job, isn't it? To make the unbearable look aspirational." She shifted, turning her body fully toward me. The movement brought us a fraction of an inch closer, erasing the last safe distance between us. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with a static that made the hair on my arm stand up. "You handled that well," she added. "The leak? Most people would have panicked. You just sharpened." "I learned from the best," I replied. She just looked at me. And then the silence changed again. It stopped being about the crisis. It became about the fact that we were two women in a dark room, bound by a secret and a sudden, terrifying intimacy. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. It was a look that lasted 3 seconds too long. It was a look that weighed the cost of crossing the line and found the price acceptable. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to step back. I wanted to step forward. I was paralyzed by the sudden, undeniable realization that the pull I felt wasn't gravity. It was her. "Adrian," I started, the name feeling illicit on my tongue. She leaned in, a degree. The scent of sandalwood and rain overwhelmed me. There was only the precise geometry of her face and the terrifying possibility of what might happen next. Then the handle turned. The sound was like a gunshot. We sprang apart as the door swung open. The noise of the party, the jazz band, the laughter, the clinking of crystal, flooded in, a chaotic tide washing away the fragile, intimate world we had built in the quiet. Walking back into the ballroom felt like stepping out of a decompression chamber and straight into the vacuum of space. The light was too sharp, diamond bright and aggressive, bouncing off the chandeliers in a way that made my eyes ache. The noise was a physical assault, a wall of laughter, clinking glass, and performative conversation. 5 minutes ago, the world had been the size of a coat closet, smelling of cedar, rain, and her. Now it was vast, loud, and terrifyingly empty. I took a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray, not because I wanted it, but because I needed something to hold. My hands were still tingling, a phantom sensation of the proximity we had just shared. I tried to reintegrate. I forced myself into a circle near the bar with the VP of marketing and 2 junior analysts who were dissecting the Q4 projections with frantic enthusiasm. I nodded at the right times. I smiled when they laughed, but I wasn't there. My consciousness had split. Part of me was nodding at a graph description, but the rest of me, the real part, was a radar system calibrated to a single frequency. Adrian. I didn't need to look to know where she was. I could feel her location in the room like a shift in air pressure, a heavy center of gravity that pulled at everything in its orbit. But I did look. Of course I looked. Every time the crowd shifted, my eyes found her. She was on the far side of the room, speaking with the chairman. She looked perfectly composed, her armor of midnight silk back in place. But then, across 50 feet of crowded ballroom, she looked up. Her eyes locked onto mine with the precision of a sniper. No smile, no wave, only a gaze that held taut and heavy, acknowledging the secret wire that now ran between us. It was a look that acknowledged the ghost of my touch still lingering on her skin. The conversation around me turned to holiday plans. Someone asked me a question about skiing. I answered, my voice sounding hollow, like it was coming from a radio in another room. The banality of it was suffocating. How could we talk about ski trips and bonus structures when the air was still vibrating from what almost happened? Then the atmosphere in the circle changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a silence that rippled outward. The group stopped talking. I turned. Adrian was crossing the floor. You read about executive presence in business books, but seeing it is different. The crowd didn't just move. They parted. It was the Red Sea parting for Moses, if Moses wore tailored silk and terrified the board of directors. Junior executives scrambled to clear a path, terrified of obstructing her trajectory. She moved with a predator's grace, unhurried but inevitable. She wasn't wandering. She was targeting. She stopped at our circle. The VP of marketing nearly spilled his drink, straightening his spine. "Director," he stammered, his confidence evaporating. "We were just discussing the—" "I'm sure you were," she cut in. Her voice was smooth, polished glass. She smiled at him, an expression that didn't reach her eyes, and then she turned that high beam intensity onto me. The rest of the group ceased to exist. "Ms. Hayes," she said. It was the same greeting as before, but the cadence had shifted. Before, it was a dismissal. Now, it was an invitation wrapped in a challenge. "Director," I replied. I refused to look away, refused to let her see that my pulse was visible in my throat. "I trust the situation is fully resolved?" she asked. The double meaning hung in the air, invisible to everyone else, but heavy enough to crush me. She wasn't asking about the leak. She was asking about us, about the heat in the coat room. "Completely," I lied. "Whatever the issue was, it's handled." "Good," she murmured. She took a step closer, reaching the standard social distance just enough to make my breath hitch. Because I find myself in need of a new perspective. The view from the corner office is limiting tonight. The band shifted gears then. The frantic energy of the jazz faded, replaced by a slow, heavy bass line that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The mood of the room deepened, turning sultry and dark. "Perhaps," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "you could help me with that." She didn't wait for an answer. She extended a hand. In any other context, across a boardroom table or in a negotiation, it would have been a polite, calculated gesture. Here, under the heavy crystal chandeliers, with the bass thrumming deep in the floorboards, it was a summons. It was a question, wrapped in a command, that demanded a specific, immediate answer. I looked at her hand. Pale, steady, manicured nails painted a dark oxblood red. And then I looked at the room. People were watching. The marketing VP was still staring, his mouth slightly open. But the magnetic field she generated distorted my risk assessment. I reached out. When my palm met hers, the air left my lungs. It wasn't the tentative, clammy grip of a social obligation. Her fingers curled around mine with a firmness that was shocking. It was warm, solid, and terrifyingly real. She pulled, just slightly, and I followed. I would have followed her off a cliff in that moment. The dance floor was a negligible risk by comparison. We moved into the center of the room. The crowd seemed to dissolve into a smear of color and noise, leaving only the two of us in sharp focus. She turned, stepping into my personal space with that predator's grace, and placed her free hand on my waist. The contact burned through the silk of my dress. It wasn't a hover, it was a claim. Her fingers splayed slightly, the heat of her palm pressing against the curve of my spine, anchoring me to her. I raised my hand to her shoulder, feeling the tension in the muscle beneath the midnight fabric. The texture of the moment changed instantly. It shifted from professional deference to something fluid, heavy and undeniably physical.
"You surprised me tonight, Miss Hayes," she said.
Her voice was pitched low, a rumble that I felt in my chest rather than heard over the music. She wasn't looking at the room. She was watching my reaction to her touch.
"I was just doing my job, Director," I managed to say, though my voice sounded breathless, foreign to my own ears.
"No," she corrected, her thumb tracing a slow, deliberate arc against my side that made my knees weak. "You saw the board. You saw the pieces moving before I did. That isn't the job. That is instinct." She leaned in closer, her lips brushing the air near my ear. "Precision is rare. I value precision." The word hung between us, heavy with double meaning. She wasn't talking about the press release. She was talking about the way we fit together. The way my height matched hers. The way our steps fell into a synchronized rhythm without a single spoken cue. The proximity was intoxicating. I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, the slight flare of her nostrils as she inhaled the heavy air between us.
This wasn't a crush.
A crush is a light, fluttering thing, a distraction. This was a pull, a deep, tectonic shift that rearranged the landscape of my world. I realized with a jolt of panic that I didn't want to let go. I wanted to lean into the hand on my waist. I wanted to close the final inch of distance and burn the employee handbook to ash. We turned, the room spinning around us. For a moment, her leg brushed against mine through the slit in her dress. The friction was electric. It sent a shockwave through me that nearly broke my composure. She felt it too. Her grip on my waist tightened, just for a fraction of a second, a reflex of desire she couldn't suppress. We were dancing on the edge of a cliff, in full view of the entire company, the public nature of it adding a layer of vertigo to the desire. It was reckless. It was insane. It was the most alive I had ever felt. But the heat was becoming unsustainable. The air in the ballroom felt thick, soupy with champagne and expectation. I saw the chairman glancing our way, his brow furrowed. The bubble was about to burst. "It's too loud," she whispered, pulling back just enough to look at me, her eyes dark with the same suffocating need I felt. "I can't think." "I know," I breathed. The heavy glass door slid shut behind us, and the silence of the winter night rushed in, instantly cutting off the humid roar of the gala. The air was biting, sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose, instantly drying the sheen of sweat on my skin. It was a shock to the system, a physical reset that snapped the blurry, intoxicated edges of the evening back into high-definition focus. She walked straight to the edge of the terrace. The city sprawled out below us, a grid of amber and white lights stretching to the horizon. From up here, the traffic was just a stream of red and white blood cells moving through the arteries of the city. It was beautiful, distant, and completely irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the woman standing in front of it. Adrienne leaned against the stone railing. It was the first time all night I had seen her support her own weight. Inside, she held herself up with a spine of steel and expectation. Out here, in the dark, she let the architecture hold her. Her shoulders dropped an inch. She didn't look back at me. She stared out at the skyline, the wind catching the loose strands of hair that had escaped her severe updo. "It looks peaceful from this height," she said. Her voice was stripped of the boardroom resonance. It was just a voice. You can't see the chaos. You can't hear the noise. It's just geometry. I moved to join her, stopping a foot away. The cold was seeping through my thin dress, but I didn't care. "It's a long way down," I offered, testing the waters. "It always is," she replied, turning her head slightly to look at me. The shadows played across her face, softening the sharp angles of her features. "That's the price of the view, isn't it? Isolation. You spend your life climbing the ladder, ensuring every step is secure, every hold is solid. And when you finally pull yourself onto the roof," she gestured vaguely at the empty terrace, "it's just you and the wind." This wasn't the director talking to a manager. This was Adrienne, admitting she was lonely. "You aren't alone right now," I said. It was a bold statement, a fact that challenged the narrative she had built around herself. She turned fully then, resting her hip against the stone. Her eyes searched mine, looking for a flinch, a hesitation. She found none. "No," she murmured, the word barely visible in the cold air. "I suppose I'm not." I took a step closer. It was an instinctual move, a desire to share warmth, but it charged the space between us with a new kind of energy. It wasn't the frenetic, public heat of the dance floor. This was quieter, deeper. I could see the goosebumps rising on her bare arms.
"You're cold," I said.
"I'm fine," she lied, the reflex of strength kicking in automatically.
"Adrian," I said.
Using her first name felt like unlocking a door I wasn't supposed to have the key to. She didn't correct me. She didn't pull rank. She just looked at me, her gaze dropping to my lips and then back up, heavy with an exhaustion that looked suspiciously like desire. "The view isn't the only reason people come up here," she whispered.
"Why else?" I asked, though I already knew the answer.
"To escape," she said. "To find something real in a building made of glass." The wind gusted then, whipping my dress around my legs. I shivered, and without thinking, I moved into the shelter of her space. We were inches apart now. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, a stark contrast to the freezing air. We stood suspended above the city, drawn together by a magnetic force that defied the logic of our resumes. Then a sound broke the spell. From behind the glass doors, a low swell of noise began to rise. A rhythmic chanting. The crowd inside was waking up. The year was ending. The sound of the swelling crowd inside grew louder. The anticipation was a physical pressure pushing against the glass, threatening to spill out and wash us away. We were standing in the eye of the storm, but the eye was closing. The tension between us had evolved. It was no longer the polite, simmering friction of the boardroom or the surprising, contained heat of the coat closet. It was a coiled spring, wound so tight that the metal was groaning under the strain. One wrong move, one snapped wire, and the recoil would be catastrophic. Adrian turned to face me fully, her back to the city, her back to the safety of the view. The shadows cast by the interior lights cut across her face, but they couldn't hide the expression she wore. It was raw. The carefully curated mask of the board director, the woman who could fire 1,000 people without blinking, who treated emotions like inefficiencies to be eliminated, was gone. In its place was something terrified and terrifyingly hungry. She looked at me not as an employee, not as a subordinate, but as the only solid object in a world that was rapidly losing its gravity. "They're waiting for you," I said. My voice was steady, but it felt like a lie. I didn't want her to go. The board, the shareholders, the midnight toast.
"Let them wait," she whispered.
The rebellion in those 3 words was staggering. This was a woman who lived by schedules, by the precise ticking of the fiscal clock. To discard time was a heresy. I've spent 20 years doing what I should. Every decision calculated, every risk assessed, every outcome modeled for maximum return. She took a breath, and the cold air misted between us. "The logic of the board says I should walk back inside, shake the chairman's hand, and forget I ever touched you. It says this is a liability." "And the truth?" I asked. I needed to hear it. I needed to know that the heat I felt radiating from her wasn't just a projection of my own desires. She looked down at her hands, then back at me. "The truth is that the logic feels like a cage tonight. The truth is that my body hasn't listened to a single command I've given it since you walked into that coat room." It was an admission of defeat, but it sounded like a declaration of war. War against the rules, against the hierarchy, against the safe, lonely architecture of her life. But I needed to be sure. The power dynamic was a chasm, and if we tried to jump it and missed, I was the one who would fall. She had a golden parachute. I just had a job I needed. "Is this real?" I asked, the question sharp in the winter air. "Or is this just a moment? Are you just looking for a way to feel something because the champagne stopped working? Because if this is just a game to you, Adrienne, if this is just a way to feel alive for 10 minutes before you go back to being untouchable, you need to tell me. You need to walk away." The challenge hung between us. I had stripped away the titles. I was demanding an answer from the woman, not the director. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. She moved. She took a step forward, closing the remaining distance until the toes of her heels brushed against mine. The movement was deliberate, a physical rejection of my doubt. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, a detail that shattered me, and cupped my jaw. Her thumb brushed my cheekbone, a touch so light it felt like a brand. "Does this feel like a game?" she murmured. Her eyes were dark, dilated, swallowing the light. I am risking everything just to stand this close to you. I am terrified, and I have never been more certain of anything. The air left my lungs. The validation was a drug, potent and immediate. The boundaries were gone. The employee handbook was ash. There was only the heat of her hand on my face and the cold wind whipping around us. We were standing on the precipice, and she had just let go of the railing. Then the vibration started. A rhythmic thumping that shook the glass doors. The murmur inside coalesced into a chant, a roar of hundreds of voices syncing up with the clock. 10. The word was muffled, but clear. The year was ending. Our time was up. Or maybe it was just beginning. 9. The chant from the ballroom was a seismic pulse, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. The glass doors rattled, holding back a tidal wave of noise. But out here, the silence between us was louder. 8. I watched the numbers reflect in her eyes. She wasn't looking at the party. She was looking at my mouth. The intent in her gaze was a physical weight, pressing me back against the stone railing. 7. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her cheek, but she didn't blink. Her focus was absolute, a laser-guided intensity that made the rest of the world blur. 6. I felt the heat of her body radiating through the silk, a furnace in the winter night. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm, out of sync with the chaotic drumbeat of anticipation. 5. She leaned in. The movement was agonizingly deliberate. The execution of a plan drafted the moment she walked into the coat room. Her hand tightened on my jaw, possessive and grounding. 4. Her lips parted. The steam of her breath mingled with mine. Then she whispered it. The words were soft, barely a ghost against the roar inside, but they hit with the force of a command. Are you still here for the midnight kiss? 3. It wasn't a playful inquiry. It was a final verification of the stakes. She was giving me one last chance to remember my job title and step back into the safety of the hierarchy. 2. I didn't step back. I leaned forward, answering with the only language that mattered. 1. Her lips met mine. It wasn't a tentative holiday mistake. It was precise. It was devastating. It had the texture of inevitability. The moment our mouths connected, the world realigned. I felt the shock of it travel down my spine, a visceral jolt. Her kiss was exacting, firm, and overwhelmingly possessive. It tasted of champagne and suppressed desire. Happy New Year! The roar from inside was deafening. Behind us, the sky exploded. Fireworks erupted over the harbor, painting the darkness in violent streaks of red and gold. The boom rattled the terrace. But I barely registered it. The sensory overload of the fireworks was nothing compared to the storm happening in my arms. I felt the tension in her shoulders break. She made a low sound, a desperate noise that vibrated against my lips, and deepened the kiss. Her hand tangled in my hair, pulling me closer. There was no hesitation now, no board director strategy. There was just Adrian, unraveling. The kiss was a conversation we had been avoiding for years. It was every silent glance across a boardroom table condensed into a single act. It was heavy with the weight of everything we were risking, and light with the relief of finally giving in. The fireworks reached their crescendo, bathing us in strobe light color. In the flashes, I saw her eyes squeeze shut, saw the raw vulnerability etched onto her face. We were standing in the wreckage of our professional boundaries, illuminated by artificial fire, and I knew I would never be able to look at her across a meeting table again without remembering this taste. The year had turned. The clock had reset. But as the first minute of the new year ticked by, holding on to her in the freezing wind, I knew the calendar was irrelevant. The real timeline was simply before this kiss and after. And we were firmly, irrevocably in the after. The light that woke me wasn't the harsh fluorescent glare of the office or the strobe light intensity of the fireworks. It was soft, gray, and filtered through heavy velvet curtains that were definitely too expensive to be mine. I lay still for a moment, staring at a ceiling that soared 12 feet above me, listening to the silence. It wasn't the empty silence of the coat room or the tense, loaded silence of the balcony. It was a settled silence, a domestic quiet. The bed was vast, a landscape of white linens, and the pillow beside me still held the impression of her head. It smelled of her, that lingering sandalwood scent and the faint, clean smell of expensive soap. I wasn't in my apartment. I was in the penthouse of the woman who signed my paychecks. I sat up, the sheet pooling around my waist. My dress from the night before was draped carefully over a chair, a ghost of the gala. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I pulled on the white button-down shirt hanging on the valet stand. It was hers. The fabric was crisp, cool cotton that warmed instantly against my skin. It was too big, the cuffs swallowing my hands, but wrapping myself in it felt like a second skin. It was a claim, a physical manifestation of the line we had crossed. I walked out into the living area. The space was open, modern, a continuation of the glass and steel aesthetic of the office, but softened by rugs that felt like clouds and art that actually meant something. Adrienne was in the kitchen. She stood by the marble island, waiting for a sleek chrome espresso machine to finish its cycle. She wasn't wearing the armor of the board director. She was wearing a silk robe the color of slate, tied loosely at the waist. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her face, stripping years off her profile. She heard my footsteps, the soft pad of bare feet on hardwood, and turned. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty that I'd never seen in the boardroom. She was gauging the morning after. She was calculating the regret. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its public polish. "Please," I said, leaning against the doorframe. She poured 2 cups with practiced precision, sliding one across the marble toward me. I took it, letting the ceramic warm my hands. We stood there, separated by the island, sipping black coffee while the city woke up below us. "We broke about 6 company bylaws last night," she said finally, staring into her cup. "7, I corrected, taking a sip. If you count the fraternization clause in the ethics handbook." She looked up, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "I wrote that handbook." "Then you know the penalties." "I do," she said. She set her cup down and walked around the island. The movement was slow, deliberate. She stopped in front of me, invading my personal space for the second time in 12 hours. But this time, there was no crisis to blame. "I reviewed the risk assessment this morning, while you were sleeping." She reached out, her fingers tracing the collar of the shirt I was wearing. Her shirt. "The projection is chaotic. The fallout could be significant. The logic says we should shake hands, sign an NDA, and pretend the last 8 hours never happened." "And?" I asked, my breath hitching as her hand moved to my waist. "And," she whispered, pulling me into her, "I find that I am entirely unwilling to accept that projection." She hugged me then. It wasn't the charged, electric contact of the dance floor. It was different. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, her arms wrapping around me with a solidity that felt structural. It was a hug that held the weight of the morning. It was intimate in a way the kiss hadn't been, because it wasn't about adrenaline or atmosphere. It was about us. I felt the tension leave her frame, felt her lean her weight against me, trusting me to hold her up. Standing there in the morning light, surrounded by the quiet luxury of her life, the power dynamic flattened completely. We were just 2 women who had found a way to be warm in a cold city. "This is going to be complicated," she murmured against my skin. "Extremely," I agreed, resting my chin on her shoulder, tightening my hold. "But I think we can handle the logistics." "Good," she said, pulling back just enough to look at me, her eyes clear and determined. "Because I'm not letting you go." Leaving an hour later felt like stepping out of an airlock. The wind on the street was biting, the noise of the city aggressive and loud. I hailed a cab, clutching my coat tight against the chill. But as I watched the skyline recede through the rear window, I didn't feel the cold. I felt the lingering warmth of the coffee, the scent of sandalwood on my skin, and the terrifying, wonderful certainty that the real meeting was just beginning. The elevator chime on the 40th floor sounded different on January 2nd. It was sharper, more accusatory. The soft, suspended reality of the holiday bubble had burst, replaced instantly by the aggressive hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial carpet cleaner and ambition. Walking down the hallway felt less like returning to work and more like walking to a sentencing hearing. The doubt had set in around 8 in the morning, somewhere between my apartment and the subway. Had the penthouse been a mirage? Was the woman in the silk robe, the one who had poured coffee with such domestic tenderness, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the thin air of the balcony? The Adrienne who ran this floor was not the Adrienne who had held me in her kitchen. The Adrienne who ran this floor was a machine, made of leverage and quarterly targets. I walked into the boardroom. The long mahogany table was already populated, a landscape of laptops and nervousness. The air was stale, recycled, and thick with the tension of the new fiscal year. I took my usual seat, the leather cold against my back. I arranged my notepad, my pen, my tablet. The architecture of my life had reassembled itself perfectly, constructing the walls back up as if the balcony had never happened. Then she walked in. She wore a suit of charcoal gray, tailored to within an inch of its life, armor designed to deflect anything personal. Her hair was pulled back, severe and tight, revealing the sharp line of her jaw. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She walked to the head of the table, opened her folio, and began to speak. Her voice was the one I knew from before, the voice of the strategy, the voice of the axe. She dissected the marketing report with surgical indifference. She dismantled the operations update with a few curt, terrifying questions. My stomach dropped. It was a mistake. It was a holiday lapse in judgment, a glitch in the system, and now we were back to the status quo. I was the employee, she was the director. The distance was back, vast and unbridgeable, reinforced by the heavy wood of the table between us. I stared at my hands, feeling the fool, mourning the loss of a warmth I had no right to keep. "Miss Hayes," she said. My head snapped up. The room went silent. The VP of sales stopped typing. "The projections for the merger," she stated, her face a mask of professional boredom. "I assume you have the revised risk assessment?" "Yes, Director," I said, my voice tight, fighting to keep the tremor out of it. "I sent them this morning." "Good." She looked at me. Really looked at me. And for a second, the mask slipped. Just a fraction. The corner of her mouth twitched. Not a smile, but the ghost of one. Her eyes, cold and hard for the rest of the room, softened with a specific, private recognition. It was a glint, a secret shared in a room full of people who were blind to it. It was a look that said, "I see you." It was a look that remembered the texture of the sheets and the smell of the coffee. She looked back at her papers, but the air in the room had changed for me. It wasn't cold anymore. It was charged. My phone vibrated against my thigh. I kept my face neutral, sliding my hand under the table to check it. A message from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "Stop worrying. Breathe." I looked up. She was listening to the CFO drone on about overhead, her face impassive, her pen tapping rhythmically against her notebook. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. We weren't just colleagues anymore. We were conspirators. The boardroom was no longer a cage. It was a stage. And we were the only 2 people who knew the script. I watched her sign the merger document, the ink flowing black and permanent, her signature sharp as a blade. But I knew the hand holding that pen was the same one that had tangled in my hair. The meeting was over, but the story was just beginning. If you want to know how we navigate the boardroom now, subscribe for the next chapter.